Hey guys, good morning. Happy Tuesday. It's Daryl here. It's 4:30 a.m. here in Connecticut on the East Coast. When you see me laugh like this, you know I've started this video about 10 times already and I had to keep having to restart it. I'm just going to flow with it. If I make mistakes, just forgive them, please. I can't start this video again. All right. Yes, I'm going to start yesterday. I did a video on the fly. I did it kind of extemporaneously. There's a reason for that. Since Sunday, I've been looking into HR 51. The push to make Washington, D.C. a state, to give it representation in Congress, because it does not. It's not a state right now. And I'll be honest with you guys, I was a good student in high school. I never failed a class. I don't remember ever hearing the story about Washington, D.C. That's because it's a completely, basically the reason why Washington, D.C. is in a state is because for the last 200 years, white lawmakers did not want African Americans to have any say in their own government, to govern themselves in the Washington, D.C. area. That's the bottom line. There is no other answer to it. Like I said, so I've been researching this. I put my notes together, and I've tried to memorize everything. And I'm going to give you a rundown. Back in 1790, the Natchitoches people were violently driven off the land by European settlers, Native American people. Natchitoches, Nacotchtank. And by the way, if you guys want the link to this to get the whole story, the History Channel, the link's down below. All right, so basically back around 1790, there was about 3,000 people in the Washington, D.C. area. Virginia and Maryland both gave some land to make the Washington, D.C. the seat of the government. The white lawmakers would go do their business, then go back and vote and live in Maryland and Virginia. A lot of African Americans during the Reconstruction after the Civil War moved to the Washington, D.C. area. I never gave this much thought, but that's when a lot of Black Americans moved there. Right now, there's over 700,000 people of the population of Washington, D.C. It has more population than 11 of the states. It's bigger than Vermont, Wyoming. Imagine this. Imagine if Alaska wasn't a state. It votes mostly Republican, and there was a push to make it a state. And Democrats were saying, no way. We can't give them representation. They'll give more seats to Republicans. Can you imagine that? That's what's going on right now. There's actually Republican lawmakers. Jody Heiss. I can't remember what state he's from. Representative Jody Heiss. His reason was that there's not car dealerships. There actually are car dealerships in Washington, D.C., but this was one of his, they're coming up with these insane reasons, because basically, going back 200 years, the only reason that Washington, D.C. is in a state and doesn't have representation right now, by the way, they're making license plates in Washington, D.C. that say taxation without representation, back like when we first made this country, why we moved here from England. Because that's basically what it is. They do not have representation in Congress. They don't have congressmen. And like I said, right now it's over 70% African American. So I think Republicans assume that they know how African Americans are going to vote Democrat, and they don't want more Democrats. They don't want more Democrats to have more power. It's basically another push to push down votes, to subvert, what's the word there? What's the word I'm looking for? Squish the votes. Like I said, this goes back all the way to 1790. During the Reconstruction and after the Civil War, especially when Black people were allowed to vote, they stripped the rights of the African American residents of Washington, D.C. of their right to vote for president and the right to elect their own local governments, giving that right to the president and Congress. It's seen as back then Congress and the president were all white Americans not from the Washington, D.C. area. That's how, and let's see, what was it? The 23rd Amendment in 1861 gave Washington, D.C. 3 electors finally, which is nowhere near adequate. They cannot have more electors for president than the least populous state. I can't remember which one that was. They can't have more than 3 electors. The reason that Republicans gave for this back in 1972 was they were afraid that black Muslims were going to take over Washington, D.C. So this has been a blatant push, a blatant effort by Republicans for not just Republicans, but for the last 200 years to not let the people, but more specifically, to not let the African-American people in the Washington, D.C. area have a vote, to have representation. It's ridiculous. Now, people are talking about, canceling Dr. Seuss and stuff like this. And there's about 500,000 African-Americans, 70% of 700,000. So over 70% of Washington, D.C.'s population is African-American. Over 70% of 700,000 don't have representation in Congress right now. And they're saying the Republicans are fighting to not let it happen because there's no car dealerships. There are car dealerships. And that's the reason. They don't have a foot to stand on. And they're arguing against letting Washington, D.C. become a state with no good reason other than to keep the people of Washington, D.C. from having a say. That's all it is. So this is about H.R. 51, like I said, the move to make Washington, D.C. a state, and I strongly support it. Look, I didn't really do justice to this story, no matter how hard I've tried for the last 2 days to memorize everything I wanted to talk about. One last thing I want to remember, and this was particularly offensive to me. John Taylor Monroe, I believe his name was. He was a Confederate soldier. This is back around the Civil War time. Right after the North won the Civil War, they took away, like I said, in 1870, they took away the right of Washington, D.C. to even vote for its local politicians, for the African Americans living there to vote for their local politicians. And this was his quote, that Congress had to burn down the barn to kill the rats, meaning had to burn down the local government of Washington, D.C. to do away with, he didn't use the word African American. I am, because I'm not going to use the word, any of those words, to keep them from voting. That's the quote he said. They had to burn down the barn to get rid of the rats. And that's what's going on today. And here we are talking about Dr. Seuss. And there's about 500,000 African Americans that don't have a right to, are being having taxation without representation in Washington, D.C. right now. So obviously, I strongly support making Washington, D.C. a state. All right, you guys have a good Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like I said, the links are down below. History Channel story of Washington, D.C. All right, have a good Tuesday. I'll be back later with another video.